Hello everyone, welcome to sqadia.com. We are at the first section of our presentation, the development of face, nose and palate. In this section, we'll talk about the development of face. We'll see what the various embryological components are that give rise to adult structures in the face. Then we'll see how the various parts of the face are formed from embryonic mesenchymal proliferations. And finally, we'll talk about the development of the nasolacrimal duct, the nasolacrimal gland, and the nasolacrimal sac. So let's get into it and see how the development of face actually proceeds. So first of all, we have the sources of development of the face. So we have there are actually 5 swellings that appear in the region of the old stomodium. So primordial stomodium is a word that would be used again and again in the slide. It's the opening of the mouth in the human embryo. So the site of adult mouth is known as stomodium. However, it is not in its adult form at this point in time. At this point in time, it's just a circular round opening, and it is in a primitive state, so it is known as the primitive stomodium. So there are various mesenchymal proliferations that appear around this stomodium. There are actually 5 in number. One of that is the frontonasal process, or the frontonasal swelling that appears in the frontonasal septum, which is a source of development of the human adult face. It forms this frontonasal process of frontonasal swelling. It forms the forehead, the external nose, the nasal cavity, the nasal septum, the philtrum of the upper lip. So philtrum is the triangular portion that connects the nose to the upper lip. In the human adult, it can be marked by 2 lines that lie above the upper lip and form a bridge or a connection between the nose and the upper lip. So since the name was frontonasal septum or the frontonasal process, it helps in the formation of the frontal aspects of the face as well as some of the nasal aspects of the face. So moving on, we have the maxillary process. So 2 maxillary swellings also appear in the maxillary area, the area of the upper jaw. So these swellings are actually 2. Frontonasal swelling was only 1 in number. However, these maxillary swellings are 2 in number. They are paired swellings, and they give rise to the lateral parts of the upper lip and the upper parts of the cheeks. So if you keep in mind the anatomy of this swelling as to where the swelling actually appears, you will easily remember the structures it gives rise to in the adult face. So moving on, we have this third swellings. These swellings are the mandibular swellings. They're actually a pair of swellings too, like the maxillary process swellings. They appear in the area of the mandible, that is the lower jaw. So they give rise to the chin, the lower lip, and the lower parts of the cheek. So when we talk about the sources of development of face, we have 5 swellings. One of them is the frontonasal swelling that forms the frontal and the nasal aspect of the face. In an adult human face, this is the frontal process and this is the nasal aspect. So the frontonasal aspect of the face is formed by the frontonasal swelling. Then we have a pair of maxillary swellings. This is the area of maxilla, the upper jaw. So the area of upper jaw, the lateral sides of the face are formed by the maxillary swellings. These are 2 in number. That is, these are paired swellings. And finally, the mandibular swellings. These are also paired, and they lie in the area of lower jaw, the portion of the lower jaw, and help in the formation of lower part of the face. These are the mandibular swellings. So 5 swellings in total: 1 frontonasal swelling, 2 maxillary swellings, and 2 mandibular swellings. So in this figure, you can see these swellings clearly. This is the frontonasal. This is the old stomodium, which I was talking about. This is the site of the adult mouth. Stomodium is also known as an opening or the primitive mouth. So this area is the old stomodium. This in yellow, the indentation in yellow is the frontonasal process or the frontonasal swelling. It helps in the formation of the frontal and nasal aspects of the face. This in green, these are paired swellings. These are the maxillary swellings of the maxillary process. They help in the formation of the lateral aspects of the face. These in blue, these are the mandibular processes or the mandibular swellings, and they help in the formation of the lower part of the face. So, the end of 4th week of development appears. We have 5 facial swellings. These facial swellings are also known as the facial primordia. They appear around the old stomodium. We've talked about it before. So they consist mainly of mesenchyme, which is derived from the neural crest cells. So migration of neural crest cells into this developing area is very important if the development does not go as planned. So there may be various craniofacial abnormalities in the fetus. And this mesenchymal proliferation is actually covered by a surface ectoderm. Let's talk about the frontonasal process in detail. They are formed by the proliferation of the mesenchyme, which lies ventral to the forebrain vesicle. So for the purpose of reference, this is the dorsal aspect of the body and this is the ventral aspect of the body. The ventral aspect of the body lies towards the anterior abdominal wall, while the dorsal aspect of the body lies towards the vertebral column. So the forebrain vesicle is lying in this area, and ventral to this forebrain vesicle is this proliferation of mesenchyme that helps in the formation of the frontonasal process. This frontonasal process finally gives rise to the middle part of the upper border of stomodium. Stomodium was this area, the opening of the mouth, and the middle part of the upper border of stomodium is formed by the frontonasal process. Now, let's talk about the maxillary and the mandibular processes. So, in green, in the figure, this green is the maxillary process. These are 2 swellings, and similarly, these blue are the mandibular processes. They're actually processes of the first arch. They're components of the first pharyngeal arch, and from there the mesenchymal swellings appear and are known as the maxillary and the mandibular swellings. So the pair maxillary process of the first arch, they form the lateral parts of the upper border of the stomodium. So this area is stomodium, and the lateral border of the upper parts is formed by the maxillary process, as can be clearly seen in the figure. So moving on, we have paired mandibular processes here. These are the paired mandibular processes which form the lower border of the stomodium. So the frontonasal process forms the upper part of the stomodium. The maxillary process forms the frontonasal process forms the upper middle part only, the upper middle part of the stomodium. The maxillary process forms the lateral part of the stomodium, and the mandibular process forms the lower part of the stomodium. So what are the medial and lateral nasal processes? So on each side of the median plane is the midline plane. So this is the median plane in the center, which lies in the midline, the median plane. In the ventrolateral part of the frontonasal process. So from the ventral and the lateral part of the frontonasal process, the surface ectoderm now thickens and it forms an olfactory placode. So olfactory placode is actually a thickening of the surface ectoderm that is formed from this frontonasal septum. This olfactory placode, it invaginates into the underlying mesoderm and forms the olfactory pits or the nasal pits. So whenever the word olfactory is being used somewhere, it always connects to the nose. So this olfactory placode is actually the precursor of the adult nose. Now this olfactory placode at this point in time is continuous with the stomodium below. So here in the figure, you can see this is the nasal pit or the olfactory placode, the circular uncolored area in this pink and orange mesenchymal process. This is the nasal pit. This is the olfactory placode which is being formed, which is the site of formation of the adult nose. And in this figure you can see at this point in time it is continuous with the stomodium. However, the maxillary process is developing towards the inside and is trying to close this olfactory placode to form the adult nose. This is actually what happens and how the development of nose goes on, but initially in the process of development this olfactory placode is continuous with the stomodium. Now the mesenchyme around the margins of the nasal pit proliferate to form a horseshoe elevation. So in the figure you can see these are the horseshoe elevations that are formed. The horseshoe elevations, again the horseshoe elevations which are formed by the proliferations of the mesenchyme. So these horseshoe elevations lead to the production of the medial nasal process. Here this in orange is the medial nasal process, and the lateral nasal process in pink. So here in pink is the lateral nasal process. So this is how the development of the medial and the lateral nasal process goes on. So there was an olfactory placode which was formed in the ventrolateral aspect of the frontonasal septum, the frontonasal process. This olfactory placode finally subdivided to form a medial nasal process and a lateral nasal process. At this point in time, these nasal processes are continuous with the stomotium. So let's see how various parts of face are developed. So the olfactory pits in which lie the olfactory nerves and all the senses for olfaction, they develop from the nasal cavities themselves. They form the nasal cavities themselves. Now the median nasal process, which was the midline, it actually thins out gradually. The membrane of it thins out because it is a vestigial structure at this point in time. So it thins out to form the primitive nasal septum. So the primitive nasal septum, which actually separates the two parts of the nose, is formed by this thinning median nasal process. Now the globular process of the medial nasal process, it fuses to form the philtrum of the upper lip. Here you can see this is the philtrum of the upper lip, and this is being formed by the globular process of the medial nasal processes which fuse in the midline. So the frontonasal process in itself gives rise to the forehead, the external nose, the nasal cavity, the olfactory pits giving rise to the nasal cavities, and the nasal septums. The nasal septums being formed by the medial nasal process. It also forms a philtrum of the upper lip by the globular part of the medial nasal process. Now the maxillary process, it forms the lateral part of the upper lip. Here you can see the lateral part of the upper lip and the upper part of the cheek. So upper part of the cheek and lateral part of the upper lip are formed by the maxillary process. And the mandibular process, it forms the lower part of the lip and the lower part of the cheek. So let's take up that in a little detail. The two maxillary processes now grow medially, that is towards the nose, towards the frontonasal, as the frontonasal process. And this lies below the developing eye, obviously, because eyes lie anteriorly and towards slightly dorsally. So the maxillary processes are developing medially to come in the midline to fuse with the frontonasal processes. They fuse with the lateral nasal process to form the lateral part of the upper nose. So they fuse with the frontonasal process, and they form the lateral part of the upper nose and upper part of the cheek. We have talked about it before. Now the two mandibular processes, what do? They form the lower part of the lip, here, the lower part of the lip, and the lower part of the cheek. Now the surface opening of the stomodium, it forms the oral fissure. So I've talked about it before. The stomodium was the site of the was the primitive mouth or the site of the adult oral cavity. So it forms the oral fissure, the surface epithelium, the surface opening, and the lateral angles of the oral fissure. These are the lateral angles of the oral fissure. These are formed by the fusion of the maxillary and the mandibular processes. Obviously, the maxillary and the mandibular processes, they come together, and as a result of their fusion, we have the formation of the lateral angles of the oral fissure. These are the lateral angles of the oral fissure. So in the figure, we can see the frontonasal process is forming the philtrum. Philtrum is the connection between the nose and the upper lip. This is the philtrum. The lateral part of the lip is formed by the maxillary process. So this is the philtrum which was formed by the frontonasal process. This in green is the part of the upper lip, the lateral part of the upper lip, which is formed by the maxillary process. The lower part of the lip is formed by the mandibular process. So, what are the various embryological bases of innervation of structures? So, what nerves actually embryologically supply these structures, and what are the adult nerves that are supplying these structures? So, it actually goes with the development. It's a very easy if you keep the development in your head at the time of development. Whatever nerve is actually supplying a structure will supply the adult structure as well. So the forehead it develops from the frontonasal process. So this portion, we're talking about this portion, this in yellow, this is the forehead, this is the forehead. The forehead is formed by the frontonasal process. The frontonasal process is supplied by the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve. Now, the frontonasal process, it originates in the first pharyngeal arch. The nerve of the first pharyngeal arch is the trigeminal nerve. So the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, it supplies the muscles of the forehead or the adult structures of the forehead. Now the nose, this again we're talking about this area in yellow. Now the nose is also made up of frontonasal process. The frontonasal process helps in the formation of external nose. It is also supplied by the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. Now we're talking about the cheek, the upper part of the cheek, this in green, the upper part of the cheek is in green, the lower part of the cheek is in blue. Now the upper part of cheek is formed by the maxillary process, and this is supplied by the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. We know that very well that the first pharyngeal arch, it divides into a maxillary component and a mandibular component. The nerve of the first pharyngeal arch is the trigeminal nerve, which gives off three branches. The optic branch, which supplies the eye and the surrounding structures. Then we have the maxillary branch in the maxillary bud, and the mandibular branch in the mandibular bud. So upper part of the cheek, which is formed by the maxillary process, is supplied by the maxillary branch of the trigeminal nerve. The lower part of the cheek, which is formed by the mandibular process, is supplied by the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. Now the upper lip is formed by the fusion of the maxillary processes of the two sides along with the frontonasal processes. So this is supplied by the maxillary branch of the trigeminal nerve. The lower lip being formed by the lower part of this mandibular process. So it is supplied by the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. So now, since we've covered the development of face and the sources of development and what nerves are actually supplying what structures, we can move on to the development of the nasolacrimal duct. So it is nasolacrimal duct actually lies in the line of fusion between the lateral nasal process. So this is the lateral nasal process. Here in the figure, this is the lateral nasal process and the maxillary process. This is in green is the maxillary process. So in the line of fusion between the lateral nasal process and the maxillary process lies this nasolacrimal duct, or initially this area is known as the nasolacrimal groove. This is the nasolacrimal groove. So this nasolacrimal groove at this point in time is lined by the surface ectoderm, and we'll see why that is important. Now the surface ectoderm, which lines this floor of the nasolacrimal groove, it forms a solid epithelial cord. This is the formation of solid epithelial cord in between the lateral nasal process and the maxillary process. So this epithelial cord is finally detached from the surface ectoderm. That is, the surface ectoderm comes to cover the anterior aspect of the face, and this is the nasolacrimal duct is buried deep down, and it does not communicate openly to the exterior. Now it gets canalized it was a solid cord initially, and now this cord gets canalized, and a lumen is formed within this nasolacrimal cord. At this point in time, it is now called the nasolacrimal duct. Now the upper part of the nasolacrimal duct, this is the upper part or the cranial part of the nasolacrimal duct. It actually widens and forms the lacrimal sac. This is where some of the secretions of the tears are actually stored. Now the nasolacrimal duct, it becomes completely patent only after birth. So in intrauterine life, it does not have an active role. The patency of this nasolacrimal duct develops after birth. It communicates secondarily with the nasal cavity in its caudal end. So the caudal end, this is the caudal end, and it somehow communicates with the nasal cavity at its caudal end, and this is a secondary communication. That is the reason when one is crying, there is also runny nose, because the caudal end of the nasolacrimal duct lies in the nasal cavity. Now the cranial end communicates with the conjunctival sac. So the cranial end of this is the cranial end. This is the cranial end of the nasolacrimal duct, and it communicates with the conjunctival sac of the eye. So in adults, it runs from the medial angle of the eye. So this is the medial angle of the eye. This is where the tears are formed. It runs from the medial angle of the eye to the inferior meatus of the nasal cavity. Inferior meatus lies on the lateral wall of the nose towards the inside, and it lies most inferiorly somewhere in this area. So this is the area of the adult nasolacrimal duct, from the medial aspect of the eye to the inferior meatus of the nasal cavity. So this was all about this section. In this section, we discussed the development of face, how various components of face were innervated, and the development of nasolacrimal duct. I hope you understood it. For further such sections, keep watching sqadia.com.